For 72 hours, no one knew if he was alive. The last confirmed transmission placed him in the Korangal Valley, one of the most hostile regions in Afghanistan, known to American forces as the Valley of Death. After that, the comms went silent. Drones couldn't see through the storm front that swept across the mountains. Ground teams couldn't move in without exposing themselves. His name was listed as MIA, missing in action. Official channels marked him for recovery, not rescue. The assumption was simple. No one survives alone that long in Taliban territory, not after an ambush, not without air support. But assumptions don't apply to men like Logan Wade. When they finally found him, he was barely conscious, face covered in blood and dirt, skin cracked from dehydration, leg torn open by shrapnel. He was surrounded by the bodies of the enemy and the shattered remains of a radio he had tried to rebuild with nothing but wire, instinct, and sheer willpower. What he endured in those 72 hours has never been formally acknowledged. His report was sealed, his footage never released. And yet, deep in the files that circulate among special operations veterans, there's a whispered phrase, "The man who never gave up the ridge." This isn't a story about war. It's a story about what one man becomes when there's no one left to rely on. When every voice has gone silent. When the only choices are surrender or survive. The wind moved differently in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. It didn't blow so much as it scraped, carving lines through the sand-dusted ridges like the scars of a forgotten war. Logan Wade felt that wind against his face as he crouched at the edge of a narrow plateau, scanning the valley below through night vision goggles that flickered slightly from impact damage suffered weeks earlier. The moon was low, barely more than a sliver, just enough to cast outlines over the jagged terrain. Wade had been deployed here before. This valley, this operation, it wasn't new. What was new was the silence, a silence that felt orchestrated, like a pause in a song you know is about to erupt. His unit, SEAL Team Echo 9, had deployed in the early hours of the morning under standard black recon protocol. They'd been dropped by Black Hawk approximately 2 kilometers from the target zone, a suspected transit hub for insurgents believed to be funneling weapons through an uncharted cave network near the Pakistan border. The objective was classified as low risk. Confirm the target, collect intel, destroy the cache, and extract at dawn. Wade was the point man, chosen not because of rank, but because of instinct. He had a feel for terrain, for threat, for the invisible weight of danger in the air. And tonight, the weight was unbearable. They moved with the precision of ghosts, boots sinking into loose shale, gear muffled by wraps and tape. The team was tight, experienced, no chatter, just hand signals and controlled breath. Every few steps, Wade would stop and listen, not for sound, but for the absence of it. Villages in this region always made noise, dogs barking, distant fires, radios crackling through static. But tonight, there was nothing. No light, no movement, as if the valley itself was holding still, waiting. Intel on this op had come fast, too fast. A CIA operative embedded in Kunar had forwarded a partial drone feed showing possible insurgent movement into a cave system outside the known grid. But there was no follow-up. No infrared scans, no confirmation. Just a single heat signature too deep to identify and an order to insert. The briefing lasted 20 minutes. The questions asked during it went unanswered. The only reassurance offered was the promise of air support on standby and a secondary extraction point if needed. Standard procedure. But Wade didn't trust procedure. Not out here. They reached the ridgeline ahead of schedule. Below them, a cluster of rocks and shadows vaguely resembled the entrance to the suspected cave. It was flanked by what looked like collapsed stone, an old wall maybe, partially buried. No movement, no sentries, no defensive markers. That was the first red flag. Insurgents in this area didn't leave anything unguarded. They set traps, posted scouts, used old Soviet tactics mixed with modern unpredictability. And yet, the entrance yawned open like a mouth waiting to swallow them. Lieutenant Reeves gave the hold signal and the team fanned out to establish overwatch. Wade moved closer, one eye on the scope, the other tracking the path to the opening. Every step triggered something inside him, a resistance, a low hum of dread vibrating through his nerves. This wasn't just quiet, it was dead space. It felt wrong because it was wrong. And when things felt wrong, Wade paid attention. He dropped to a knee near the edge of the slope, adjusting his angle to get a better view inside the mouth of the cave. His optics picked up heat, but not movement. The signature was too consistent, too stable. It wasn't a person, it was a decoy, a heat trap. Basic, cheap, effective, designed to lure teams like his into a false positive. That's when the doubt turned to certainty. They weren't here to find weapons. They were being drawn in, lured, isolated. He tapped twice on his mic, signaling a silent alert, then scanned the surrounding cliffs. The terrain was brutal. Sharp inclines, limited cover, blind corners, everywhere. Perfect for ambush. The only problem was that he couldn't see anything. No glint of optics, no movement along the rocks. Just an empty stretch of high-altitude desert soaked in moonlight and menace. Then came the smallest of sounds, a single stone tumbling down the cliffside above them. Wade's eyes snapped toward it, but it was already too late to call a retreat. He knew the sound. Not natural. Not wind. A footstep. Someone was up there, watching, waiting. His hand moved to signal again, to issue a fallback. But then the world erupted. The mountain cracked with light as the first IED detonated near the rear element of the team, sending dirt and fire skyward. The concussion wave dropped him sideways, his vision swimming with static and sparks. Gunfire followed instantly, echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. Muzzle flashes danced across the ridge in calculated rhythm. His team responded, trained instinct taking over, but they were pinned, outflanked, exposed. From his position, Wade rolled behind a rock outcropping, switching to thermal briefly to track targets. The enemy was everywhere, at least 15, maybe more. Coordinated, mobile, and moving fast. They weren't responding to contact. They were executing a plan. The whole ridge had been turned into a trap. A funnel of fire designed to rip apart anything that came near the cave. Wade called for elevation retreat, but the channel was dead. Static. The comms were already jammed, or worse, compromised. He couldn't raise command, couldn't reach the evac point. All he could do was move, shoot, and survive. The last thing he saw before the ridge began to collapse was Lieutenant Reeves disappearing behind a cloud of dust and falling stone. Then the earth gave way beneath him. He tumbled down the slope, hitting rock, dirt, and air in a blur of weightless pain. His world narrowed to darkness, his body twisting mid-air as the sounds of war faded into silence. When he landed, the impact drove every ounce of breath from his lungs. He lay there, alone, broken, and buried beneath the mountain's indifference. The mission was over. The war was not. Dust filled his mouth, gritty and suffocating, as Logan Wade clawed his way from the shallow crater where he'd landed. Every muscle screamed in protest, ribs grinding against one another with each shallow breath. His ears rang, not from any single explosion, but from the accumulation of force and chaos that had detonated all around him in the span of less than a minute. He blinked away blood that ran in a narrow line from his temple to his cheek, eyes stinging as they adjusted to the dim glow of firelight beginning to flicker across the valley. All around him, the terrain was chaos incarnate. Smoke rolled in thick tendrils over the ground, wrapping the jagged rocks and shattered earth in a choking embrace. Somewhere above him, the ridgeline, once a strategic vantage point, was now a wall of falling rock and fire. The coordinated ambush had turned the team's advantage into a death trap. Gunfire still echoed from the upper passes, but it had thinned. The initial burst of insurgent fury had given way to targeted suppression fire. They weren't just eliminating targets. They were containing the site, pushing survivors inward, cutting off routes of escape with terrifying precision. Wade pulled himself behind the shattered remains of what looked like an old Soviet munitions crate, half buried in the dirt. His left arm throbbed from a partial dislocation, and he was sure his right ankle was fractured or worse. He did a quick inventory with the limited mobility he had. Rifle intact but scratched. 3 mags, 1 loaded. Sidearm present, comms fried, water low. His radio's display blinked erratically. Nothing but scrambled static and coded error messages. UHF was down. No signal, no link to command. That meant no drone eyes, no overwatch, no extraction coordination. Whatever was coming, he was facing it alone. He tried to reach the team net again, listening for any trace of familiar voices in the void, but the channel remained empty. Either they were dead, scattered, or out of range. The realization hit like a second explosion. He was cut off, pinned behind enemy lines, with no functional support and a force of militants closing in around him. From his position, he could see movement on the upper ledges. Silhouettes moving in coordinated sweeps, checking for survivors. Some carried flashlights filtered through red lenses, others methodically cleared areas with muzzle discipline and practiced motion. These weren't amateurs. They knew what they were doing. That made them even more dangerous. Wade remained perfectly still, regulating his breathing, letting his body disappear into the landscape like another piece of shattered debris. Time passed in slow, pulsing fragments. He listened to the rhythm of their footfalls, counted the seconds between commands shouted in Pashto. He had learned enough during past deployments to pick out keywords. Clear. Over there. Check the body. They were doing close work now, sweeping bodies, confirming kills. That meant they'd reach him soon. He had maybe 5 minutes before they found this position. Maybe less. He needed distance, elevation, options. With a grunt that triggered a cascade of pain down his spine, Wade crawled low along a shallow trench formed by erosion runoff, keeping his silhouette low and weapon close. Each movement was a calculated gamble against pain and detection. He could hear gunfire still echoing from the far ridge. Maybe a survivor from his team still fighting. Or maybe insurgents flushing out the last resistance. He didn't know, and he couldn't afford to find out. He crawled for nearly 20 minutes before he reached the next natural cut in the terrain. A narrow ravine filled with loose shale and dried roots, sloping down toward what might have once been a riverbed. He dropped into it silently, only to immediately freeze as 2 militants crested the ridge above him. They were speaking casually, their rifles slung, their bodies relaxed, confident. That told him something even more unsettling. They believed the area was secure. They believed the fight was over. He waited until they passed, then began to slide downhill, the slope aiding his descent but punishing his already wounded ankle with every impact. At the base of the ravine, he found what he was hoping for: shelter. A small overhang formed by a fallen slab of granite, partially obscured by brush. He crawled inside and took stock. His heart raced. His breathing was sharp and erratic. But he was alive. He sat in silence for what felt like hours but was probably closer to 40 minutes, waiting, listening. He didn't move. Eventually, the footsteps faded. The search passed by, and he was alone in the dark again. Wade's mind went operational. He had 2 priorities now: evade and endure. He checked his wounds again, adjusting the pressure wrap around his ankle with strips of gauze from his IFAK. The bleeding had slowed. The pain had not. He took shallow sips of water and broke a caffeine tablet between his teeth to stay alert. His body trembled, not from fear, but from the cold calculus of survival grinding against his physical limitations. He needed rest. He needed food. He needed support. But he had none. Just himself, the tools on his back, and the training in his blood. Night deepened, and with it came the cold. The high altitude turned warmth into memory, and his body began to shiver uncontrollably. He wrapped himself in the emergency blanket from his kit, listening to the rocks shift and the wind whistle through cracks in the canyon walls. His thoughts drifted to his team, to their last positions, to the sheer volume of gunfire they had faced. No one could have survived that. Not in one piece. Maybe not at all. He had to assume he was the last. That thought hit him harder than any bullet. Not because he feared death, but because the mission had changed. He was no longer a SEAL operating with a team. He was a lone combatant, deep behind enemy lines, cut off from command, hunted by forces with home field advantage. Every movement from here on was about one thing: survive until extraction became possible. If it became possible. He clutched his rifle to his chest, eyes scanning the black beyond the overhang. No movement. No sound. Just the mountain, the night, and the enemy somewhere out there, still searching. He stayed awake the rest of the night, counting the seconds, listening to the earth breathe around him. When dawn finally came, it brought no warmth, only visibility. He pulled his hood up, buried his face in shadow, and began crawling again, deeper into territory where no maps would help him, and no friendly voices would reach. It was hour 12. 60 more to go. By the time the second day began, Logan Wade was no longer a soldier on a mission. He was a fugitive hunted by ghosts, living off instinct and calculation, barely recognizable even to himself. His face was streaked with ash and dried blood, his uniform torn and stained, and the ache in his bones had settled into a kind of background noise that never faded. only shifted from sharp to dull and back again with every movement. He had long since stopped thinking in hours or minutes. Time was now measured in sounds. Footsteps above him, a breeze through the rocks, the snap of a twig that might be an animal, or might not. In this part of the Afghan highlands, noise equaled life or death, and silence was rarely safe. Cut off from command and team, his only allies were the terrain and his ability to disappear into it. The ravines he followed were dry veins of the mountains, once carved by water, but now filled with loose shale and heat. During the day, they baked. At night, they froze. He moved only during the margins, dawn and dusk, when the light distorted shapes and shadows, when the temperature didn't betray his breath or the noise of his boots. He avoided ridgelines, avoided paths, avoided places that gave even the illusion of safety. He had no GPS, no satellite imagery, no updates. Only what he could remember from the briefing, and what he could read from the land. The peaks here were more than just rocks. They were walls, barriers that distorted perspective and severed routes. More than once, he followed a line of descent only to find it ended in a vertical drop too steep to navigate. Every mistake cost him time, and time was blood. He was running on half a canteen of water, and that was before the temperature hit triple digits under the exposed sky. His tongue stuck to his teeth. His lips cracked. He'd removed his tactical gloves and tied one around his ankle to reinforce the makeshift bandage, now soaked with dried blood and dust. The other glove he cut apart to make a wrap for his trigger finger, swollen, bruised, but still usable. He still hadn't fired a shot since the ambush. That was by design. Ammunition was too precious, and the enemy too close. He spent hours at a time motionless, tucked beneath outcroppings or inside eroded crevices, watching the landscape through a cracked lens of his damaged monocular. He spotted movement more often now. Patrols. 3 to 5 men. Always armed, always scanning, their voices low but urgent. They were searching in wide sweeps, methodically. Someone knew he was still alive. Someone high enough in the local network to keep teams in the field, even after most insurgents would have declared victory and moved on. This was personal. Not revenge, humiliation. A SEAL, surviving, evading them. It would make them look weak. And in this part of the world, weakness demanded blood. The injury in his thigh had worsened. The bleeding had clotted but left behind a red ring of angry flesh, hot to the touch and stiff. He had no antibiotics, only iodine and a field syringe. He used both, pushing the burn into the muscle and biting into a strap of nylon to keep from screaming. Infection meant fever. Fever meant confusion. Confusion meant mistakes. And mistakes out here meant death. He scavenged what he could. Once, from a half-burnt goat shelter he stumbled upon by accident, he found a discarded tea flask with 3 ounces of brown water. He filtered it through a shirt sleeve, added iodine, and drank it slowly over hours. Another time, from the body of a Taliban scout he encountered by chance, already dead from shrapnel or perhaps a misstep with their own explosives. He took a pouch of dates, a cheap cigarette lighter, and a strip of duct tape. The tape he used to reinforce the grip on his knife. The dates he rationed into 2 pieces per 6 hours. They gave him just enough energy to keep moving. Barely. By the 32nd hour, he hadn't spoken aloud in over a day. His mind began to fold in on itself, thoughts running in loops. He reviewed SOPs, recited memory drills, listed the names of every man on his team, alive or dead. It kept the hallucinations at bay. Mostly. Shadows began to move even when there was no light. He started hearing footsteps that weren't there. Breathing that wasn't his. He chalked it up to the fatigue, to the dehydration, to the madness that comes when a man has been hunted for too long. It wasn't until the 36th hour that he made contact, not with his team, not with command, with a shepherd boy, no older than 10, appearing over a ridge as Wade was crawling beneath a shattered tree trunk. The boy saw him, froze, eyes wide, mouth open. In that moment, Wade knew everything could end. One scream, one shout, and the fighters would come running. But the boy didn't scream. He said nothing. Just stared. Wade slowly raised a finger to his lips, then reached into his vest and tossed the boy the last unopened energy bar he had. The boy caught it, stared again, then disappeared over the ridge without a word. Wade didn't know if he'd been spared or marked. He didn't wait to find out. By the end of day 2, he had covered over 10 kilometers on foot, mostly crawling. His ankle had swollen to the size of a grapefruit. He couldn't put weight on it anymore. The nights were no longer cold, they were bone-deep freezing. He hadn't eaten since the dates. His water was gone. And still, he kept moving, because stillness was death. The mountain pass he now entered was narrower, shadowed by steep cliffs on both sides. It gave him cover from drones, which he suspected were watching now, either enemy-operated or from Allied forces, unsure who they were tracking. He saw no lights, no signal. But he imagined satellites above him, silently orbiting, blind to the lone shape hiding between rocks. He stopped only when he reached a cave, shallow, barely enough to crawl into. There he stayed for what felt like eternity, watching the entrance, listening. He dozed in fragments, 10 seconds, 20, waking with a start each time, sure someone was standing over him. By the end of the third night, his body was failing, but his will was not. He was cut off, yes, no maps, no team, no radio. But something in him refused to surrender to the silence, something old, something born not of training, but of survival instinct honed in 1,000 invisible moments. He would keep going, even if it meant crawling through the teeth of the earth, even if no one ever found him, even if he never made it home, because the enemy would not own him. Not now. Not ever. The fourth morning broke without ceremony, just a slow gray light pushing through the cracks in the cliffs, spilling across the dirt in pale, colorless waves. Logan Wade lay still beneath the shallow lip of rock that had been his shelter through the last stretch of darkness. His body no longer felt like his own. The tremors in his hands had intensified, not from fear but from starvation, dehydration, and sheer physiological collapse. His face was sunken, lips crusted with dried blood, and every breath rattled faintly through a throat lined with dust and silence. He hadn't spoken in more than 24 hours. His voice was gone, and even the act of swallowing brought pain. But his eyes, bloodshot, sunken, raw, were still alert. They never stopped scanning. He no longer remembered the exact number of hours since the ambush. Time had lost form. It wasn't night or day anymore. It was intervals of exposure, motion, concealment, and torment. The pain in his leg had settled into a fevered numbness. The wound was infected. Pus had started to leak through the dressing, now reinforced with duct tape and dirt-stained gauze. The infection brought flashes of cold sweat, nausea, and sudden weakness that made him collapse more than once when trying to shift position. Still, he endured. Because even now, Wade was calculating, tracking, listening to the wind, reading the terrain. What changed that morning wasn't external. There were no explosions, no sudden enemy contact, no miraculous rescue beacon falling from the sky. What changed was internal. Something broke. But it wasn't weakness. It was surrender of a different kind. Wade stopped thinking in terms of escape, or even survival. He stopped measuring the mission by tactical objectives or next steps. What remained was something deeper, an absolute will to move forward no matter the cost. It wasn't strategy. It was something ancient, a primal refusal to be erased. He stood for the first time in hours, swaying like a dying tree in a sandstorm. His leg buckled, but he stayed up, bracing against the rock wall beside him. He rewrapped the wound as best he could, clenching his jaw as he pulled the tape tight. The pain was overwhelming, sharp, white-hot, and blinding, but he welcomed it. Pain meant he was still alive. He took the last sip from his canteen, swishing it around his cracked mouth before swallowing. There was no more food, no salt, no sugar. His blood pressure was dropping. His fingers tingled. His lips had split open in at least 3 places. He was dying. That much was obvious. But if death was coming, it would have to find him in motion. He adjusted his gear slowly. His rifle had 2 full magazines left, both checked and cycled the night before. His sidearm was jammed from dust exposure, useless now unless cleaned. He left it. The extra weight meant nothing if he couldn't trust it to fire. He took the remaining utility knife and looped it through a strap on his chest. He rubbed dirt across the back of his hands, over his cheeks, across his exposed skin. The goal now was to vanish deeper, into the mountains, into the folds of rock and smoke, into the silence. His best chance was to reach the high ridgelines. From there, he could possibly find a signal, or, if nothing else, a place to make his last stand visible to any friendly aircraft patrolling the region. The ascent was brutal. Every step was a gamble. The terrain rose sharply, and the rock was loose and crumbling. The cliffs he climbed weren't trails. They were scars in the earth, worn by storms and time, not meant for human passage. Twice he slipped and nearly fell, saved only by slamming his forearm into jagged stone, which tore open a fresh gash that oozed down his sleeve. The sun rose higher. It was a cold sun, deceptive, masking the intensity of its radiation. He felt it cooking the back of his neck, his exposed scalp, his already burned lips. He kept going. Somewhere near the halfway point up the ridge, he saw movement below. 3 figures, silhouetted against the dust, fighters, armed and searching. They moved slowly, methodically, as if they weren't tracking him, but cleaning up a path they already expected to be cleared. Wade dropped flat, pressing into the side of the slope, willing himself to become part of the rock. He didn't breathe, didn't blink. They passed without looking up. That moment of invisibility felt like power, like affirmation. He still had the upper hand. He was still 1 step ahead. Hours passed. Or maybe only minutes. Time became elastic again. At the crest of the ridge, he found what he hadn't dared hope for. A small clearing, barely 20 feet across, but elevated and open to the sky. From here, he had line of sight over 2 valleys. He dropped to his knees, pulling a fragment of mirror from his kit. A signaling device from the old days, cracked and barely reflective. He aimed it toward the horizon, angling the light. A desperate measure, yes, but out here, even desperation could be precision. He flashed the signal, waited, flashed again, waited. Nothing. Then he collapsed. Not from impact, not from gunfire, from the sheer exhaustion of movement, of exertion, of keeping death at arm's length for too long. He fell sideways, curling slightly around his rifle. Not as a defensive act, but as if his body could only accept sleep when wrapped around the thing that had kept him alive. He awoke to sound, not voices, not gunfire. Rotors. Faint. Distant. But real. He staggered upright, fumbled for his flare. Red smoke. Barely enough propellant left to eject more than a lazy trail of color, but he lit it, waved it, raised it high above his head. His hand shook violently. His legs buckled. He fell again, eyes on the sky. The helicopters passed once, then circled back. They had seen him. He smiled, or tried to. His face barely moved. But in that moment, he knew the turning point had come. He had not been rescued yet. He was not safe, but he was seen. And in a war like this, where silence buries the fallen and the mountains swallow the truth, being seen was a beginning. A distant crack of gunfire rang out behind him. The enemy had seen him too. The gunfire came fast, sharp, echoing off the cliff walls like a signal flare of death. Logan Wade rolled instinctively, his body moving before his mind had time to register. The flare slipped from his hand, its trail of red smoke now curling in chaotic spirals across the plateau as bullets cracked past his head and punched into the rock behind him. Dirt exploded inches from his spine as a second volley followed, more coordinated, more confident. The enemy had eyes on his position. The flare had worked, but not just for rescue. It had drawn fire like blood in water. He pulled himself behind a slanted boulder, just large enough to shield his upper torso, and forced his rifle to shoulder, checking his magazine. 13 rounds. He counted each one as if they were breaths. No margin for panic. No luxury of hesitation. He was no longer escaping. He was holding. This ridge was his line. And if they wanted to take him, they would have to bleed for every step. Movement emerged at the lower edge of the slope. 4 silhouettes at first, staggered and slow, creeping through brush and rock with the caution of men who expect a wounded target. That was his advantage. They thought he was dying. They didn't know he had already accepted death hours ago and decided it would not take him easily. He steadied his breathing, slowed his pulse, and let the first come into range. The rifle snapped once, clean, precise. The first man dropped without a sound. Wade didn't move. Waited. The others froze, looked back, shouted, then split left and right, taking cover. One returned fire blindly. The rounds sprayed high. Wade shifted to the edge of the rock and fired twice more. Another hit. The body slumped behind a fallen log. The third man ducked behind a tree, returning fire in short bursts, while the fourth began to circle wide. Wade knew he couldn't outshoot them all. Not with 13 rounds, not with his condition, but what he had was terrain. The high ground gave him sight. The chaos gave him silence. He fired again, clipping the edge of the tree and forcing the third gunman to retreat. That bought seconds. Enough to reposition to a better vantage point. Low crawl, dragging his injured leg like a dead limb. The pain was blinding, but he locked it down, burying it beneath focus. They were close now. He could hear them shouting, trying to coordinate. They weren't amateurs, but they weren't trained soldiers either. He caught pieces of command. Hold position, go wide, flush him out. They knew they had limited time before the birds returned. They were pushing hard to finish it before American steel rained down from the sky. The fourth man appeared to his right, too fast. Wade spun, fired. The shot went wide. The second round caught him in the stomach. He collapsed forward, gasping. Wade didn't wait. He crawled to the body, took the insurgent's AK and spare mags, swapped his near-empty rifle for a weapon he could feed. The AK was heavier, dirtier, but it would fire. And that was all that mattered. Another explosion of gunfire erupted from the east slope. 2 more fighters entering the engagement. Wade was boxed in. His breathing hitched. He ducked low, bullets striking rock and sparking overhead. His body screamed to collapse, to rest. But there was no rest here. Only blood and steel. He counted the rounds in his head as he fired. 3 bursts, 2 targets. 1 fell, the other took cover again. His hands shook now, the fever rising behind his eyes. He was sweating through his clothes, pulse ragged and uneven. But every movement was pure will. Every trigger pull a final act of resistance. He was no longer fighting to survive. He was fighting because there was no other choice. Then came the scream, not his, an insurgent, hit, screaming as he rolled down the embankment. The others hesitated, scattered. That hesitation saved Wade's life. Because that's when the rotors returned. Thunder filled the sky as 2 MH-60 Blackhawks cut across the horizon like armored specters. Their rotors kicked dust and stone into a frenzy. 1 peeled left to engage, side door open, minigun spinning. The fighters below tried to scatter, retreating into the tree line. Too late. The gunner opened fire. The sound was deafening, a stream of lead tearing into the mountainside. Branches exploded, rocks split, men fell. Wade dropped his weapon and raised both arms, barely able to hold them above his head. His vision swam. He was smiling now, blood in his teeth. He felt himself collapse again, the heat from the flare mixing with the cold of blood soaking his chest. Ropes descended, shadows moved around him, boots slammed to ground, American voices. 1 knelt beside him, rough hands lifting his head, checking vitals. Wade couldn't respond. His throat was raw. He tried to speak, but only managed a whisper. The soldier leaned in to hear it. Wade mouthed a word. Not help, not medic, just Ridge. Then he passed out. He was lifted into the bird, strapped down, IVs stabbed into his arms mid-flight. The noise faded. The world tilted. But one thought remained, buried beneath pain, exhaustion, and the fog of collapse. He had held the line. He had not let them through. And that was enough. The silence came slowly, not like the sudden stillness of a firefight's end, but the kind that creeps in over days, through the machinery of recovery, through the antiseptic haze of hospital rooms, through the cold white walls of institutions designed to put soldiers back, together without ever asking what they had to become to survive. Logan Wade awoke under fluorescent lights, his body wrapped in gauze and tape, ribs immobilized, lungs rasping against a machine that breathed for him for the first 72 hours. They told him later he had flatlined once in transit, again in the trauma bay. He didn't remember. He remembered only the feel of the AK in his hands, the dry rattle of the rocks beneath his boots, and the color of the sky when the Black Hawks finally came. In the official reports, the mission was scrubbed, the ambush classified as a compromised reconnaissance insertion. The full scope of the operation was redacted in every available record. The names of the dead were listed in brief lines, their service acknowledged, their sacrifice folded into the never-ending machine of military history. Wade's own involvement was noted in 4 sentences. Injured during ambush, presumed dead, survived 72 hours behind enemy lines, recovered alive, no medals, no press, no interviews. Not because there was shame, but because there was policy. There are missions meant for history, and there are missions meant to disappear. His was the latter. The Navy offered a reassignment, a desk, a position in intel, training stateside. He declined. He said little in the weeks that followed. The debriefs were short, conducted by people who had never smelled cordite in the wind or felt what it was to lie absolutely still with death circling inches away. He gave them facts, timelines, approximate coordinates. He did not tell them about the moment he saw the shepherd boy. He did not tell them how long he had gone without blinking, how many rounds he had counted in his head every night like prayers. He told them what they needed, nothing more. They discharged him quietly 6 months later, under medical separation. The paperwork was clinical, unemotional, full of terms like partial disability, combat fatigue, and unspecified traumatic injury. There were no ceremonies. There were no salutes. Just a man walking away from the only life he had ever known, wearing the scars of a war no one would name and carrying the silence of a mission that no longer existed. He bought a small cabin in northern Montana, far from cities and traffic and people who asked too many questions. The land was quiet. The air smelled clean. There were no walls covered in certificates, no shelves of framed photos, just stone, wood, and silence. He kept a rifle above the door, though he never hunted. He maintained his gear in pristine condition. Routine was the only thing that still made sense. Wake at dawn, coffee black, walk the perimeter, check for prints even though no one came. It wasn't paranoia, it was habit, memory written into muscle. Some nights, when the wind blew just right, he would wake in a cold sweat, rifle gripped in hands that had long since healed but never stopped feeling the trigger. He never screamed. He never panicked. He just sat on the floor until the tremors stopped, then stood and walked out to the porch to smoke in the dark. He never reached out to the families of his team. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know what he could possibly say. He had been the last, the one who had made it out. He carried them with him in silence, each name recited in his mind every morning like a roll call. Each memory preserved like relics no one else would ever see. They were his now, his burden, his oath, his ghosts. The only visitors he ever received were from the base. Once a year, a liaison would drive up to check in. Medical, administrative, formalities. He answered their questions, signed their forms, and watched them leave. They never stayed long. There was nothing in his eyes that invited conversation, nothing in his tone that encouraged stories. But still, the legend spread. Among younger SEALs, whispered at bars and inside deployment tents, there were stories of a man who had held a ridge alone for 3 days. A man who had been left behind and refused to die. They spoke his name carefully, as if it belonged to something ancient, untouchable. They never knew the details. They didn't need to. The silence filled the gaps. Years passed. The world changed. Wars ended, and others began. The valley where he had fought was retaken, abandoned, retaken again. No one remembered the rock where he'd made his stand. No one marked the clearing where the flare had burned red. But he remembered. Always. Every year, on the anniversary of his extraction, Wade would climb the ridge behind his cabin. It wasn't high, not compared to the mountains of Afghanistan, but it was steep enough to hurt, just enough to remind him what it meant to earn every step. At the top, he would sit for hours without moving. No phone, no comms, just him, the sky, and the weight of everything that still lived inside him. He never lit a fire, never made a sound. He simply sat there as the sun disappeared behind the trees, and the silence settled back in. And in that silence, there was peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from surviving what should have killed you, and choosing not to let it define what's left. He had gone to war. He had been broken. He had come back. Not whole, not healed, but alive. And that, in the end, was enough.